Hey everyone, I'm just going to go over how to write a class, what kind of keywords we're going to be looking for in Java, and I'm going to give you the file when I'm done so you can actually look at the code. So if you can't quite read what's going on the screen, that shouldn't be too big of a deal. So what we're going to program today is just a class for a car, for a generic car class. So the first thing that you want to do is start with the keyword public. Now, most of the time, you're going to want to make your classes with the public access modifier. We'll go over more about access modifiers at a later point, but for classes, you usually want it public. If it's private or protected, it's going to be a little bit harder to work with. There are certain cases where you're going to want to use those, but we're going to use public today. So you want to start with public, and this is a class, so we're going to make sure we type class here, and then we're going to name our class car. All right, so this is just us setting up the framework for us to work in. We have a public class car. All right. The next thing we want to do is we want to have a list of number of doors, or we may want to have each door independently of each other. If we were going to have each door be an independent object, we would want something like an array list where we can keep all of the door objects together. But here we're just going to keep a nice simple number of doors, and we're just going to call this number of doors. All right, and we're not actually going to give it a value. Remember, we're basically creating a recipe for how we're going to create our objects, which just means we need to tell it what instance variables are important and what methods are important to our objects when we create them. So next, we're going to say that it has a particular type of engine. Now, we don't actually have an engine class type. We are going to assume that there is one in our program. So it's going to yell at me here. Don't worry about that too much. But we're going to just have a nice engine. And then we're going to have something maybe that represents the percentage of fuel that we have remaining. And that's just going to be a nice double. All right, and we're going to say that this is percent fuel. You'll note that I am using camel casing for all of my variable names. This is pretty standard for Java. All right, next we might want to include something like color. Now, color is something that's included in Java if we include the correct packages, but we're not going to worry about making sure that we have all of that included. We are just worried about a basic class definition, and we're just going to say that this is called color as well. Now, if you start anything with a capital C, like here, that is going to be a class type. You always name your classes with a capital letter, and anything with a lowercase letter starting with it, that's usually going to be a variable name, with the exception of things such as int or double. Now, there are classes for integers and doubles, but again, that's something we're going to worry about later. That's not something we're going to worry about now. You can just use int and double anytime you need to use those variable types. All right, next we might need to define some methods. Now, methods get a little bit more tricky. We do have private methods for particular classes. So one we might have is a set of getters and setters. So we might have a public get, let's say we want to get the color of the car, so we'll get color. Right? And we want to do something like that. Now, what this is going to do, this is going to provide a way for people to access the variable types that we have, the variables, the instance variables that we have in our particular objects, without actually making them public themselves. So ideally, all of these are going to have a nice little access modifier in front of them called private. This means that they're only accessible directly from the class itself and not to those outside of the class. This allows us to do something we call data protection. We'll get into that a little bit more, but this is generally what we want to do. This is generally how you want to program that. When we write this method here, though, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we return a static color, and we also need to say what type we're going to return. So in this case, we're going to return a color. All right. So next, we're just going to return our color. That's it. That's all that's going to happen with that. And we could also do a setter. So that would look something like public. We wouldn't have a return type, so this would be static void. Static just means that we don't want them to be able to directly mess with anything. And we're going to say set color, and we're going to give it a color object. We're going to call it C. And then we're just going to say that our color is equal to C. And that's going to go ahead and replace our value with that inputted value. All right, so this is the general idea of how we write our different types of classes. Now, you can have any kind of variables. These are the instant variables that I decided on as being important, but there could be other ones that are important to you in your particular program, and you'll want to make sure that you use those properly. Now, we don't actually have to have these static in here for these methods. You will use those depending on different things that you need, and we'll talk more about the different types of modifiers for both classes and methods in the future. Don't worry about those too much for now. What you're seeing here at the end, where I have a public class car, I have private variables, and then I have a public getter and setter for the particular variables that I want people to be able to access from outside of my class. Now there's other types of methods that we might want to write, such as a public void move class, or sorry, not class, method. So this move method might allow us to input a speed or a coordinate to move to if we had something like that. So let's say that we also had in here a private, we want this to be an integer. Let's say it's an x coordinate, and then we had a private integer y coordinate, right? We want to be able to move our car to a different int. Let's say this is a, and int b, where a will be our x coordinate and b will be our y coordinate. So we would just say x coordinate is equal to a, and the y coordinate is equal to b. Now, this isn't actually how we'd want to move it, because if we're moving a vehicle in this way in a program, we probably have a graphical interface that we want to move it across, like in a video game. So there's going to be a procedure for that. But again, this is just a basic example of being able to write a class, what the syntax looks like, and what kind of modifiers you're going to want to use. Things to keep in mind is that you should be using curly braces at the start and the end of your class in order to open and close it, just like you would in a C++ program when you're writing a function or a method or anything of that sort. Same thing with your methods here. These are all methods. And then with your variables, typically you want to keep them as private. Make sure for the labs you're following the instructions, though. I think we might start you off on not necessarily having a modifier, but good programming practice would be put that private modifier in front of them and then make the methods to interact with them public so that they're not directly messing with your variables, which will become important later when we talk more about data protection and what that means in Java. Again, I'm going to release this code, this file to you directly, so you'll be able to download it and look at it on your screen and see the type of syntax that we use for this.